want to promote your business? Do you want to talk about your nonprofit organization? Do you want to talk about your culture? Introducing the online web TV, Afrique Today. Fogham. You can watch us live at the same time on 4 platforms: Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and using the Afrique Today app. Download our app today for Android or Apple. Promote your business today. For more information, go to www.afriquetoday.com. Afrique Today, the best of digital TV. Afrique Today TV presents, every Friday at 7 p.m., the voice of AAU, American Africans United. Host Dr. Yvette Butler Yaboa, MD, and co-host The Invisible Man. American Africans United is a membership organization, and our mission is to promote the idea that people of African descent have common interests, connected by citizenship, culture, and ancestry, and should be unified in our efforts to have and to build communities that are strong economically, politically, and socially. AAU's goal is to build bridges between African Americans, African immigrants, African Caribbean communities in the United States, and the African diaspora, so that all parts of the community can increase its capacity to have life and have it more abundantly. The voice of AAU, every Friday at 7 p.m. on Afrique Today. Afrique Today, the best of digital TV.
Welcome, welcome. I think I was muted, so we're going through some technical challenges on my side this time. And welcome to the voice of AAU. And we are happy to have a wonderful guest today. I am your host, Dr. Yvette Butler Yaboa, and my co-host, Is my co-host here the Invisible Man? Okay.
Hello.
Okay, wonderful. I'm like, don't say it's just me now. But we are so excited today. As you know, this is Mental Health Awareness Month, and a lot is going on in the world and here, just everywhere with mental health. And people really don't understand a lot of what mental health means and how important it is. So we have two amazing, amazing guests today, and we are so excited. But as you know, before we introduce our guests, we would like to set the stage by showing a video, and then I'm going to introduce my two wonderful guests to you. So, can we have the video first about just a little bit about what mental health is?
We understand that stigma affects everyone, but it is unique to culture and community. And unfortunately, in the African American community, for a number of reasons, there are what we refer to as racial disparities. There's trust issues with the medical community. There is sometimes the inability to receive services from people who look like us, who properly diagnose us. So in the African American community, there are a number of issues that we need to address. And we unfortunately receive behavioral health care services at about half the rate that people, quite frankly, white Americans receive it at. So we need to take our mental health as seriously as our physical health.
So today we're here to talk about mental health, especially mental health in the Black community. And without further ado, I want to introduce my wonderful guests that we have here today. We are so excited to have two wonderful doctors in psychology. First, we have the assistant professor from Baylor College of Medicine, no Baylor College of Medicine. Let me first go. I want to give you the first person who's an amazing young lady, Maysar Akbar, PhD. She's the Chief Diversity Officer of the American Psychological Association. Now, this is amazing. And I want to thank her first of all for coming on this evening, because this is really important to all of us, but really in the Black community, where we need to understand how important mental health is and how it affects our daily life. And Dr. Akbar, she holds a PhD in clinical psychology from the St. Louis University and a master's in community psychology from Florida Architectural and Mechanical University. And that's Florida AMU from Tallahassee. And she has a bachelor's from the State University of New York at Albany. And so we're really excited to welcome Dr. Maysar Akbar. And our next guest, and before we want you to tell us a little bit more about yourself as well. Our next guest is Danielle Busby, Dr. Danielle Busby. Now, she's assistant professor at Baylor College of Medicine, Texas Children's Hospital. So you're out in Texas, right?
Yep,
So
I am.
You're a little bit behind us, so thank you for coming on. And we know you're probably still working. But let me tell a little bit about yourself. She received her bachelor's of arts in psychology from the University of Michigan, and her master's and PhD in clinical psychology from the George Washington University. Dr. Busby completed her pre-doctoral internship with child trauma specialization at Duke University Medical Center. So we want both of you to really talk a little bit about what mental health means, and really how we as people of color, we need to be more in tune to this. So without further ado, so Dr. Busby, you're right in front of me. So I'm gonna start with you first. Could you tell us a little bit about what mental health means to you, and how important is mental health to us as a community?
Absolutely. So first, I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me to be here today to talk about such an important topic. And when I think about mental health, I think about a range of things. I think about, the technical definition of it includes our emotional, psychological, social well-being. However, I think it's about an overall sense of wellness, right? Like Am I able to function well? Am I able to maintain relationships? Am I able to engage in my work in a meaningful way? And am I able to really have that balance? And so I'm really excited that we're able to be here today and talk about this, particularly in the Black community, because I feel like a lot of times that conversation is kind of shunned or it's pushed to the side in efforts to kind of put attention on other things. So thank you so much for having us, and I'm excited to be here.
Before you go on, you need to tilt your camera up a little bit. Not it's down, up. There, yep, a little better, a little bit down. There you go. Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. Dr. Akbar, tell us a little bit from your definition as well. And really, how does it affect people of color?
That is such a great question. And thank you, Dr. Busby, for laying the foundation.
Dr. Buzz, I'm sorry.
Oh, can you hear
I'll
me?
Be quiet.
The invisible man just coming right on in.
Yeah, I'll be quiet. I'm so excited.
Why are you trying to take my light?
I'm sorry. Forgive me.
I'm joking. So, thank you, Dr. Busby, for laying the groundwork for the definition of mental health. And, one of the things that I would add to that definition, and then I'm going to go ahead and address your question about what does it mean in communities of color, and particularly in the Black community, is that sometimes we have a misconception between the difference of mental illness and mental health, right? And mental illness is something that is a diagnosable, disorder that we may be suffering from, because sometimes it's because it's gone untreated, sometimes because we have in some ways inherited or have a vulnerability to that mental illness. Sometimes it has to do with the incredible amount of stress that we're under. And we know right now, as it relates to COVID, a world pandemic, that there are folks all over that are experiencing a great deal of mental distress. And so, what I want to be able to demonstrate in the difference between the definition, although we use it interchangeably, is that mental illness requires a set, amount of treatment goals. It requires for us to be able to seek out treatment in order for us to engage in our wellness and in our trajectory to be, to be our best selves, to show up in our best selves. But mental health is something that everyone should do. Everyone should want to care for their well-being, for their mental well-being, for their emotional well-being. And we should actively engage in that, just in the same way that we would actively engage in our health in any other way, our physical health in any other way. So what does it mean for the Black community? Well, I think that, if we look at this from a historical lens, mental health was something, or, mental health treatment, let's say, was something that was never afforded to communities of color. It was actually a luxury that was only, positioned for those that had privilege. And so when you think about, the historical relationship between the Black community and mental health, there wasn't ever a well-established relationship. So it's very difficult to determine what that was going to look like moving forward. Now, with the the lifting up and fighting against stigma, with the better understanding of what mental wellness can do for us, I think that we have an opportunity to re-engage with our mental wellness in a very different kind of way. So I hope that helps to sort of define both the difference between mental illness and mental health, and how we can take a look at mental health as part of our survival, honestly.
Yes.
And I appreciate that distinction that you made between mental illness and mental health, in the sense that mental illness is this diagnosable set of symptoms that we want to be sure that we're treating in an evidence-based way. And mental health is the same as when we use the term physical health, right? Like, we don't necessarily think of physical illness when we say physical health. We just talk about it globally. And so when we think about mental health, I think it's important to think about the range of things that influence it for everyone, right? Like, what are some biological factors that influence that? What are life experiences that may influence that? What are family history of mental health problems, right, that may influence that? And thinking about it holistically. So thank you so much for that distinction. I think it's a really important one to begin this discussion.
Well, thank you both for that too. And I do want to tell you guys, this is a live show. So we are broadcast nationwide and also internationally. So this is a live show, and we do have people. Sometimes they call in, sometimes they don't, but we do, and the call-up number will be up there. So if we do callers out there, you can always call in. We have a new system that we're trying out today, so we can have multiple calls. So we're hoping that you won't have problems getting through. But this is a live show, so remember, audience, if you have a question, please don't hesitate to call in. We have two unbelievable, I'm so excited we got the two of you on, but these two young ladies are so well equipped with knowledge for about mental health and everything, and they're actually at the top, in the top tier of knowing what to do and how to handle it. So I want to go back to that clipping that we showed. And they talked about racism in America and how people of color, especially Black people versus whites, and how does racism in America and throughout the diaspora impact mental health, and will it ever be neutralized? So I'm not sure which one of you guys want to jump in on that, because we really want to talk about some of these things, because we as a Black community, we don't understand that sometimes racism is part of the system, and what happens and how does that affect us, and will it ever be neutralized?
Yeah, I can jump in and talk about it a little bit. For me, this has been the topic of my career for the last 20 years or so, and it's really helping people to understand that there is an unbelievable interaction between racism and mental health, and a lot of times we don't think about it that way. We isolate racism to the social determinants that are associated with racism, right? Community violence, systems that have been created that are discriminatory and create inequalities like healthcare, policing and law enforcement. And we sort of put them in these different components. We isolate them in these different components, but we don't think about what it does to the whole person. And one of the things that are so important to think about is that every encounter that a person of color and Black people in particular have with every encounter with racism chips away at a person's dignity. And at the end of the day, what you're seeing is that studies are showing and demonstrating the incredible impact that it has on our health, from the deterioration of our not just our mental health, but our physical health. You're seeing it in high blood pressure. You're seeing in higher levels of heart disease. You're seeing it in maternal mortality rates. You're seeing it in so many different ways. And I think it's time that we stop separating these two things as if they operate in isolation. They actually operate simultaneously, and they do chip away at who we are, at our very existence, and they do absolutely create a trauma experience. And that is why you're seeing much more information related to racial trauma. You're seeing the field starting to pay attention to racial trauma. In fact, I wrote a book called Urban Trauma, which really unpacks racial trauma in a variety of different ways. So we as a community need to understand that there is an interaction that we are absolutely feeling, that we are not crazy when those things happen, that we are not overreacting, but that these implications of racism are extremely real and deteriorate both our mental health and our physical health.
I
Yes,
want to add
thank
to
you.
that.
Thank you. So what? Go ahead if you want to add something.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think it's such an important point to really think about how mental health and physical health are one and the same. It's a cycle. If you experience something from a mental health perspective, it's going to have physical effects on your body. There's a book that talks about like our body keeps the score, and it definitely does. And when you have a range of stressors as it relates to your physical health, you're going to feel more stressed. You may feel more anxious. You may feel more down. But when we talk about racial trauma and we talk about racial discrimination specifically, there's been a ton of research, a ton of data for both children and adults about the really negative effects of racial discrimination and racial trauma. And that is increased depression, increased anxiety, increased substance use, right? And all of these things have physical impacts as well. And I think a lot of times, because I'm a child psychologist and I work with youth and families, people think that experiences of racial discrimination aren't impacting kids the same way because maybe they don't understand what's going on or they don't have the insight that adults have. But actually, that's not true. Kids are experiencing some of the same impacts that we're seeing in our adult individuals. We're seeing that in kids too. And so just thinking about the long-standing impact, right? Like, so if I know that I'm experiencing this as a teenager or as a child, and then it's continuing on into adulthood, it's one thing to carry a weight for a minute or a few hours, right? But it's another thing to carry it for several years, for generations, right? And that's when we start talking about generational trauma and things of that nature. I just really want to paint that picture for us because I think that's really important. I think sometimes we think about them as these one incidents and then they're done, but it's really a continuous set of incidents that we're all holding. And as more attention is being given to racial discrimination and racial trauma, I think also thinking about how we're consuming that information, right? So, for example, social media and just the range of media outlets that we have, as we see greater exposure to events that are related to racial discrimination and racial trauma, and how much we're taking that in, youth and adults, that's also impacting our health. And that's also impacting how much we're consuming in ways that we may not have been consuming before.
Now, Dr. Busby, I was going to stick with you a little bit and ask you more about, especially since you're a child psychologist, with COVID, and they're talking about post-traumatic stress syndrome. What are some of the things that we should expect to see from our young people as we move back into, they call somewhat normacy, but we will see what happens. They say we're moving to a but I'll tell you honestly, I don't want to go back to normal how it was before, especially for Black folks, because normal for Black folks has not been a good thing. And people keep talking about this back to normacy. I don't want normacy anymore. I want something different for me as a Black woman, as a Black mother, and as a Black person in a community that is not very friendly to my Black babies. So tell us a little bit about what we should possibly expect to see and how can we help our young people through this transition and some of the things that we should look at due to COVID-19.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent question. And I think it's twofold. As a child psychologist, I work with youth and families primarily, and I primarily work with adolescents who have some cluster of depressive symptoms, right? And so during this time, we have seen an increase of patients and need, so much so that we can't really meet all of the needs, right? So we're really struggling with even just being able to be able to help all of the families that are in need. And I think for many of the youth that I'm seeing, these are youth that really didn't have problems before. They didn't really struggle with aspects of mental health, but this isolation, them specifically, tough. And so, we're seeing the increase in depressive symptoms. I work around suicide prevention, and I work with a lot of youth who have suicidal ideation, just kind of this idea of like, I don't even want to be here anymore. So we're seeing that. As we talk about going into the new normal, a lot of my youth who struggle with anxiety, they have been in the house for the last year, right? So they haven't really had to deal with anxiety around, going into the world. What does that mean? Is it safe? And they haven't had a lot of practice. So as we talk about transitioning back into the schools, that's a really scary topic for them. And it's a lot of stress about, am I going to go? What is it going to be like when I go? And I think it's so important to acknowledge, as adults, I think it's so important for us to acknowledge the range of losses that youth have had. So yes, COVID-19 is horrible, and we've seen a lot of grief and a lot of loss as it relates to lives, but also experiences, right? So a lot of my teenagers, they talk to me about the loss of being able to go on their middle school trip, or being able to transition to the new upperclassmen hallway. And these things may feel really small to us, or even prom, for example, like being something they can't do, or a particular dance. Like, these are things that feel small to us, but to them, they're like really big social factors, and they're really big. They hold a lot of meaning. And so I think they've had to grieve a lot of that while simultaneously being flexible with figuring out school online, figuring out how to work from home along with their parents, and like all the different things. And I think for Black youth particularly, this year, and the things that have been happening in our society as it relates to racial tensions and Black people dying at the hands of police officers, et cetera, like that's something that's been happening. But I think that the death of George Floyd, for example, has really brought forth a lot of additional attention because we were all sitting still when it happened, right? We were all in the midst of a pandemic when this happened. And I think kids are paying attention. And so I think a lot of times we think our youth are like, just not aware of the major problems, but they ask me these questions too. Like, is it safe? They want to understand the death of George Floyd. They want to understand the range of things that are happening in this past year. And I think a lot of times we want to shield them from it. But I think what we can do is, one, be honest. We need to be honest with our kids about what's happening, but we want it to be developmentally appropriate, right? So like, how do we name our own feelings? Like, wow, I'm feeling really frustrated. I'm feeling really sad. I'm kind of unsure about how to move forward. And I think really being honest with them and then modeling for them, I don't have all the answers, but this is one way that I'm coping. This is one way that I'm taking a break from the range of things that are happening. These are the things that I'm grateful for, even in the midst of this situation. So I think it's important for us to model for our kids what works for us so that they can begin to practice some of those same strategies.
Yes. Thank you so much for that. Oh, Dr. Akbar, you want to add something on?
Yeah, because APA, the American Psychological Association, has been looking at the amount of stress that, just ordinary citizens are encountering. But we've also been looking at the data from the perspective of Black families. And, what we have seen is that COVID has really driven up the behavioral health issues in children. We're seeing an increase in them reporting significant social isolation, loneliness. They're seeing a higher prevalence of divorce or separation with their parents. And all of these things continue to, if you think about like trauma as like a stacking, right? It's like it's stacking and stacking and stacking. And all of these incidents, their little bodies are just not meant to deal with that type of trauma, that compound, what we call it compound trauma, one trauma after another. I think the most starking statistic that I read this year, which really made me pause, not just as a psychologist, but as a mama myself, is that between the beginning of the pandemic around 2019, April of 2019 to April of 2020, we saw a 66% increase in children going to the emergency room around mental and behavioral health issues. 66%. I mean, that's really showing you that kids are suffering. And, in another survey that they completed, 14% of kids said, if this doesn't stop soon, if I'm not able to connect with my friends and connect with my social life in some type of meaningful way, my mental health is not just going to suffer now, but it's going to suffer long term. So kids are being very verbal about and having an awareness about what's happening to them psychologically and saying to us, this is just not normal. And they're right. It's not normal because we as humans are meant for connectivity. We're meant to want to connect with one another. We're not meant for isolation. And a host of different things happen to us when we're in isolation. So we do have to pay, I'm so glad you asked this question, because we have to pay particular attention to our children. This is so much beyond just COVID. This is a lot about what they're seeing, what they're experiencing, and what we're prepared to put in place as parents, and especially in school as they come back. We can't educate kids the way we thought we could in the past without thinking about their mental and behavioral health.
And that's very important because I'll tell you, on my other hat that I wear, I actually have run a youth organization with young people. So we've been doing all this online, there's online instructions and I run an after school program, which is interesting to actually work and focus on those, those students who are already delayed and have challenges academically. And most of our parents decided not to send their kids back to school. And we queried the students, and a lot of the students wanted to go back, but the parents did not want them to go back. So that in itself was so interesting, and it's funny because they thrive to come online with us. So we've been doing a lot of out of the box things, doing movies, having fun days, and we are focusing on the academic piece. But now we've had to integrate a lot more things and they just want to come online just so they can hang out with each other. And the funniest thing is, they might not say one thing to each other online. They'll be in the chat box, maybe chatting a little bit, but they just want to be online together, even if they're silent, which is something that was very interesting to me. And I was, and I, it was, and it still strikes me. And I keep thinking these young people really need to be connected somehow, some way. And hopefully we can start seeing them being actively engaged again. But the parents don't want them to go back. So we're dealing with that. And so I know and we've been on the other side of just there for you. If you want to talk, my line is open. They all have my personal cell phone just to call me, and they do, just to say, hey, how you doing? And so I'm like, and I'm just here just to listen, because you don't really know what's going on. And we don't want, it's a difficult time for adults, but especially with children who have now been out of school. They're going to be now, it's a year and a half. Some of these kids are going to be out of school and not looking, they're looking forward to going back next fall, but we'll see what happens. But on that note, I want to go back to say, what does it look like, a person's identity? How does, what is the identity and state of mind of a person? How do you really identify when someone needs mental health intervention?
Yeah, I think that that's tough. Usually, especially in the Black community, it is not self-identification that happens. It's somebody else saying to you, something's wrong. Something's really
Yeah.
wrong, right? And it might, right? Like you're acting a
Yes.
little, and you fill in the rest of the blank, right? Like of what we might say to one another, right? But I think that what ends up happening is that it's that reflection, somebody else from the outside saying to you, I'm concerned. I've been seeing X, Y, and Z. We've been arguing a lot. We've been getting into verbal, exchanges, sometimes very heated exchanges. You look overly sad and not motivated. Something's happening where you're not connecting. So it might be that another person is sharing with you what they're observing in terms of your behavior or your mental state. Now, I will tell you that it doesn't mean that because somebody tells you that you're like, okay, well, let me go seek therapy then, right? What's the first thing that we say? Ain't nothing wrong with me, like,
That's true.
I'm stressed out, or work is overwhelming me, or the kids are too much right now, or we will create other justifications for the observations that we get from others. And sometimes it is with our family, sometimes it's with our friends, sometimes it's with our spiritual leaders at church or whatever spiritual place you tend to connect with in terms of your faith. And sometimes it's because there is someone else that identifies it. So for example, with children, and I'm sure Dr. Busby can talk about this, it might be a teacher, or somebody at the school in the lunch cafeteria, or a principal that says something's happening with your child and we really need to figure out what's going on. And what's interesting is that we have to get overly convinced that that is really the truth, right? If you think about it, most Black folks won't seek treatment until they are in desperate crisis. I mean, things are falling apart before they say, okay, I'm going to make that phone call. And that's a shame, because between when somebody first told you this to crisis, there was a lot of opportunity for a different trajectory to go the way that it had to be before things started to really fall apart. So if there's anything that I would really share with your viewers, is to say, if folks are bringing up, that something ain't quite right, listen. Don't reject it right
Yeah.
away. Take it in. Ask, what do you mean? Be curious about it, because sometimes that is the cue that will allow us to go ahead and seek therapy. And seeking therapy doesn't mean that you're losing your mind. Seeking therapy means that you're finally able to connect with an objective person that can guide you through your life circumstances at that point. It's not a death sentence. It doesn't mean you're crazy in any kind of way. It just means that you're going through a struggle that perhaps you alone can't take care of. And, I'm going to continue to put this to physical health. If your blood sugar is going down, and if you're getting dizzy, and if you can't see yourself walking, and you're fainting at work or at home, wouldn't you go out to a doctor and say something is really, really wrong? You know,
Yeah.
there is no difference here. You have to be able to take care of yourself. In fact, there is nothing more important than your mental health, your mental capacity to be able to take care of your entire body. So I really suggest that not only do you listen to folks that are giving you that feedback, but when available, try to seek out the support that you need on your own.
Yeah,
I
thank you so much
absolutely.
for that, and because our audience needs to know that. Now, I want to, and I want to look at how we here in the United States look at things very differently. People, I'll say Americans. Now we have a huge immigrant population, and I'll be honest, going back to my medical career, because I'm actually an MD, and I'll tell you honestly, when I did psych and I did my psych rotations, it was interesting looking at immigrants. Now, immigrants treat mental illness as if they don't even exist. And the majority of them, and especially if you're in a foreign country, they just lock you away and put away the key. And it's like, oh, that there's something wrong. How do we address that? And how do we talk to our immigrant population who's out there? Because we have a high immigrant population who also watches our shows. How do we get them to understand that it's okay to seek therapy? It's okay to have a mental illness or not be mentally well at a certain point in time. How do we tell them that you just need to get to the doctors? I mean, because that is something that is a huge, huge barrier, especially with the immigrant population, especially with the Black immigrant and Latino immigrants. They do not see mental illness as we Blacks in the United States, and also definitely not whites. There's always a stigma, but how do we tell them to get in here, and how to identify and help their kids if they see something happening? So, Dr.
I
Butler, you
think
want to
that's
talk about how we can identify the kids, and Dr. Akbar, I want you to talk more about the adults and getting them to come in themselves.
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So first, I love the distinction, because I think a lot of times when we talk about this, we just kind of talk about Black people holistically, and we don't kind of make those
Yeah.
distinctions about the cultural differences that exist, right? And if I'm honest, before we can even talk about what individuals need to do, I always struggle with questions like this, because I have to acknowledge that there are really good reasons why people don't seek treatment, right? Like when we look at the historical context of how people have been treated within the health system globally, there's a lot of mistrust. There's a lot of reasons why people don't feel safe when coming to treatment. So I always think about, how can we call mental health providers and mental health systems to their own attention to say, what are there things that you need to do that kind of meet patients where they are, meet individuals and communities where they are, in a way that makes the space feel safer and makes the space feel like a space that will be understanding of their cultural differences or their cultural experience, right? So I have to say that
Mhm.
first. Then when thinking about talking to people individually about what to do, I think a lot of times when we think about mental health, we're like, oh my God, is something wrong? If something's wrong, like, you need to go do this thing, versus like, you are worthy of the opportunity to be well, right? Like you are worthy of the resources that are at least available to you about how we can change your trajectory. And so whenever I think about mental health, I think about functioning, right? So if you're recognizing that functioning is falling apart for you as it relates to your work environment, as it relates to your home, for your child, a lot of times I see kids, because the first thing I see is school. And I know in a lot of immigrant populations, particularly if they're immigrants and they're in the US now, education is really important, right? And so if you see a kid who's not performing at their highest ability, a lot of times it's like, oh, you're not trying hard enough, you got to push through. But the reality is they could really be struggling with a range of mental health concerns that are impacting how they're performing academically, right? Like if I'm really anxious, I'm going to really struggle with being able to focus in a school environment. And so I think if we put the focus on like, you are worthy of these things so that you can have your best possible outcomes, I think that's one way to think about it. But then also, like, what are the resources available that make this feel relatable to this family, right? Like, how do we kind of work to destigmatize, but then also educate in a way that doesn't feel so distant from certain groups? So a lot of times I feel like the mental health field is confusing, right? Like even as a provider, I read some of these acronyms. I'm like, what does that mean? And I studied this for several years, right? So I always say, when you look at a provider's name, it's like alphabet soup afterwards. I don't know what all these different letters mean. And I don't expect a family to know what all these different letters mean. So I think in general, we need to do a better job at making things accessible, making them relatable, and making them understandable to all populations, and particularly immigrant populations, because we see such a difference in their ability to connect with services and even their interest in seeking. But I think if the platform or the spaces were better prepared for all people, we could potentially see a difference.
Yeah, I
Thank you so much,
completely
Dr.
agree.
Akbar.
I completely agree with that. I have to be honest. As an immigrant myself, I'm from the Caribbean. My parents migrated to the United States when I was about 5 or 6 years old, and one of the things that it was very interesting to me and probably sparked my interest in psychology is that when I would live my existence here in America, which was very different than when I was, back home in my island, it was like this severe level of impoverishment that I came into, right? Because we certainly didn't have the resources. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and as a young child, and for all intents and purposes, I would have checked off every box, of a child who lived in poverty, who was around violence, who barely was going to make it really out of my situation. And then I would go back home, sometimes during the summer to spend time with my grandparents. And what I would see was the same desperation, but for different reasons, and there was poverty, but it was a very loving, caring type of situation, because most of the people were poor, but no one really thought through mental health. And whenever I would bring that up, people would laugh at me, back home, because they would be like, we don't have a health infrastructure where we can think about mental health. That's like, they go into the insane asylum and there's like 2 rooms for them, there. And then, right? And it was like, and then we throw away the key. And I'm like, and there was no distinction between those that had substance abuse or, neurodevelopmental delays or, serious mental illness like schizophrenia. Everybody was dumped in the same category in the islands. Mm-hmm. And then they were all, ostracized and couldn't be part of like the general community because you weren't a viable, working adult and a contributor to your family or to society in any kind of way. And typically, if they weren't in one of the facilities, then they would be homeless, right? They would be in the streets. And folks would be like, oh, there goes crazy so-and-so, walking down the street. And that's how we identified, mental health. We didn't identify it as something that needed intervention, that needed treatment. And honestly, I think that one of the reasons why I chose this career is because I became fascinated by that distinction that, here in America, although we had the resources, all the governmental structures, there were clinics and things like that, there was still this kind of dissonance that occurred between, what when I didn't feel well, I still didn't seek out the treatment that I needed. And in the Caribbean, you were just ostracized. I spent a couple of months in Jamaica when I was finished. I was doing my master's thesis after while I was at FAM. And one of the things that was so interesting in my time there is that I went to the one psychiatric ward in Kingston, Jamaica, and I was floored. I was like, wait a minute. There was no clear entry into how you got in. It was just like I said, a catch-all category. And there was
Yep.
no clear treatment plan in terms of what got you healthy enough to get out, you know?
Mhm.
And then what if you weren't so severe in the spectrum? What happens to the whole host of people, that suffer from some type of, the statistics right now are like 70% of the population have had one traumatic event in their lifetime. So imagine about that. 70% of people. So if you
Yes.
wanted to seek treatment because you're not severely mentally ill, you just happen to have a grief or a trauma or a loss or something happened to you, a sexual assault, where would you go? There was nowhere to go because there were no offerings. And so the part of it is that when you are an immigrant then to and you come to this country, that infrastructure, the lack of infrastructure that you see in the Caribbean, does you carry that mentality over here. And then you couple that with like, you know you need to grab yourself by the bootstraps, you need to work 10 jobs, you need to be better than the average person,
Yep.
black folk got to work twice as hard, 10 times as hard. You couple
Yep.
all of that, and who's got time to think about mental illness or mental health or mental anything? And so I think that that's really what we're seeing in terms of a phenomenon with Caribbean folks and with folks that are immigrants to this country, all together. I hope that we can change that, because when we begin to educate folks around the importance of this, when we begin to have higher and COVID has opened up the opportunity for that conversation. Because here's the thing, really, we've been talking about COVID as a pandemic. We've been talking
Yes.
about racism as a pandemic. And what we know is
Mhm.
looming is a mental health pandemic, a global mental health
Yes.
pandemic. So we have no option but to begin to talk about this. And I'm hoping that the way that y'all here are educating folks around this topic, this is where it begins. Having these conversations, being honest, being transparent, and seeing doctors like me and Dr. Busby who are from the community, who have decided to engage in this work because we know we have lived experience that we bring to the work, and that you can trust that you will be in good hands when you're seeking out the type of treatment that will make you better, because this is the path to healing.
Okay, it's a
Now let me ask a
15-minute
question.
warning.
How?
Let me.
Oh,
I have a question.
okay. Go ahead. Yes.
I want to raise a couple of questions. First of all, I want to acknowledge that this is Women's Mental Health Week, and
Yes,
I've
it
been trying
is.
to find out when it started, but it's hard to. I think Jimmy Carter, but I think it might even begin before. And the facts are that women are caregivers. So when we were talking
Yes.
about identity, uh, I wanted to zoom in on something, and I keep hearing black, people of color, community of color. I want to make a confession. I am an Afro descendant, which is the legal definition that was adopted by 18 and 19 countries, with someone from this country representing the United States and La Ceiba, Honduras in 2002. That's the legal definition at the United Nations for the people who were transported to the Americas for the purpose of slavery. And so I'm going through cognitive dissonance when I keep hearing you say black community, people of color and stuff like that. So once I know who I am, I think, and that was part of the question, how does a person's identity determine their state of mind? So, and you did mention cognitive dissonance. So very quickly, what is cognitive dissonance? And are we as a people, Afro descendants, throughout the diaspora suffering from cognitive dissonance? And the final point is there's a question, and you received the questions about life is no fun living in the ghetto. Could you talk about the conditions of life that surround our lives? Thank you.
That was a lot. So let's say, so you can break it up.
All right. First of all, how can we continue to call ourselves different names? People of color, community of color, people of color. I mean, when the term is Afro descendant, that's the legal name. We must let the world know that we are Afro descendants. We're not Africans. We are not Caucasians. We're not Negroes. You know the N word. I'm not going to even disgrace anybody by saying it. We are Afro descendants. So until we rally the troops around that and let that become our recognized identity, we're going to have problems. So what do you think? Am I losing it because I'm so centered on that?
I don't think you're losing it. I mean, you're right. You know, I think that identity is, especially when we look at racial identity, can be such a complex thing. And right now, in this day and age, when there are so many intersectional identities, meaning multiple ways in which I can identify, and folks are trying really hard to kind of figure out where their identity lies. Words like Afro descendant and categories like that really connect us to, Pan-Africanism and our African roots are really important. And, has there been an evolution of words? Do they capture, all of the essence of who we are? I don't think so. And I think that, if I look at this and your definition of Afro descendant and what you described, I would say yes. I would say I'm an Afro descendant. I would say that clarifies, this distinction that if you are these categories, right? If you are not what would have been considered historically, let's say, Black or African American, then that means that you don't belong to the African diaspora, or that you're not part of Pan-Africanism. When you say Afro-descendant, you're able to say, well, it doesn't matter where you were born, right? If you can trace your roots back to your Africanness, then, you belong within that category. And that does help support creating a type of racial identity that is strong. What we do know about racial identity is that when we can anchor, especially children, in racial identity, and they grow up to be adults that feel very secure in their identity, that has a host of positive and pro-social outcomes on them, right? You see higher levels of self-esteem, you see higher levels of empowerment, higher levels of agency. So I absolutely agree with you there. And I do believe that we need to get better with our descriptors, better with getting closer to what our identity really is and where we come from and what does that mean. I mean, and not to belabor the point, but if we think about it, right, there are studies, scientific studies, archaeological and sociological studies that show us that, all traces back to mitochondrial Eve, right?
Yep.
Right? So like at the end of the day, aren't we all Afro descendants?
Yes, ma'am.
Yep.
All right,
Yep.
then.
We're all African from Africa.
Dr. Busby, you got any comment?
Yeah, I wanted to add to that. Like, one, I appreciate the question. And I think there's a lot of power in language, right? Like, it's a lot of power in how we describe things and how we name things. And I think that the way you kind of heard us speak about is like the range, right? Like, we see people identify in a range of different ways for a range of different reasons. But I really want to honor the point of, being Afro descendants in this country. And like, I hear that point from you in the sense of like, if we can't name that and if we can't really identify with that, that can be, the core of a problem in thinking about outcomes, because I definitely agree when we look at the research, when we talk about racial identity, being grounded in your racial identity, having a strong racial identity, and we can break this up in a bunch of different ways that I won't go into, but we know that those are related to a lot of positive outcomes. And thinking about that, I think that drives home the point of our need to be more descriptive and be more clear so that we can be more authentic in our identity and not necessarily, just accepting what's given to us. Because sometimes I think we accept whatever is the terms that are available and we're like, well, I'm kind of this, right? But if we are able to kind of the history and dive into who we are as people, I think that does create a better foundation for us to grow from a mental health perspective. But as we talked about earlier, also connected to our physical health. And I mean, we could do a whole nother, podcast and radio, production about the ways in which all of that kind of shows up in other ways. So I really appreciate that distinction. And as you kind of spoke further, in thinking about what does this mean for us as a people? What does this mean for us in trying to kind of transition and grow and really know who we are so we can transition? And I think like when we think about our school systems, right? Like how are we teaching these things? When we think about our homes, how are people growing to understand identity, for example? Like how are we socializing our kids? How are we socialized around who we are? And I think all of those things are really pivotal for our mental health.
Thank you. That means I'm okay. I'm not mentally diseased for thinking that way.
No.
Well, no, I'm glad you asked that because I don't know if you guys remember. I don't know if you remember, but the census about 20 years ago, they had about over 50 different classifications that we as Black folks could just say who we were. And that was one of the most worst censuses ever that they had, where they had every different, you can choose from so many different racial backgrounds or how you want to identify yourselves. And that is something that has been consistent and prevalent in this country. And you don't have those type of things in any other country. And, that I've been to. And I've been to a lot of different countries. I lived in Mexico. I lived in the West Indies. I lived in Antigua, West Indies, South Africa, Ghana, Ethiopia. And you don't have those problems of identity in those countries. And so it's very interesting, not to the degree that you have it here in the United States. But I wanted to ask a question now. How important is it for a person to see a therapist who looks like them and who can relate to them? Or is it important at all? And especially for children, and Dr. Husband, why don't you let me know if that's an issue? And also, Dr. Akbar, for adults, do you think that should be a concern and taken into consideration of finding a therapist who has a similar background as we do and looks more connected to us? Or or would that be an issue at all?
If I promise to answer your question if I can piggyback off of something you just said, please.
Oh yes, definitely.
You're making such an incredible point about the way that words and categories are used to, to tick off a box, to continue to place people in smaller and smaller different categories that creates differentiation. And when we do that, what is set up is this idea of, pitting races against one another, right? This is where colorism takes root and becomes real live, right? Because, I can disconnect myself further and further from, my roots, or from, let's say, being an Afro descendant by calling myself, Latino, or by calling myself, Indian, or by calling myself all these other things, and then if I further wanted to explore, then, what does the census say? I'm white, non-Hispanic, and keep checking boxes and keep right? Like, how many boxes do you have to check in order to keep unpacking yourself into something? And I want to make that connection to the question that you're asking, because imagine what it does to your psyche to have to continuously justify who you are and your identity. And for that identity to be misplaced, misconstrued, and often weaponized against you, right? And I think that that is critical to our health and well-being moving on to the future. So what does that mean then when you actually step into the arena, when you have the courage and you finally have found the gumption to step into the arena of treatment because you say, you know what, this is important for me. This is what I need to do in order to better myself and better my life and my family. And now you are in a situation where there's a cultural mismatch, right? Where people may not understand your lived experience. They may have the training and the capacity to deliver evidence-based treatment or treatments that are associated to your diagnoses, let's say, but they don't get who you are, the wholeness of who you are, or when you experience certain types of discriminatory actions, because of the color of your skin or because who you are and what you represent. And I think that, what the data shows in general, and this is more historical data than current data. So I'd like to kind of revisit what new studies we'll be looking at and this was a study that I did a long time ago when I was in St. Louis, with Dr. Veda Thompson around the perceptions of treatment for African American patients when they were matched with a same race clinician and matched with a different race clinician. And what the findings of that study revealed was that in terms of their trajectory related to their treatment plan, there was no difference in terms of outcomes or improvement. So whether you went to same race or different race therapist, the outcomes of treatment yielded no difference. But what was qualitatively different was the therapeutic relationship and the trust that you were able to establish in that therapeutic relationship. And that's important. That's important because if you can't anchor yourself in that therapeutic relationship, then the likelihood that you will come back to that, even if your symptoms were alleviated for that point in time, will be very low because you can't connect to that person and you're not able to see the value the way that you would in a therapeutic relationship with a same race clinician. So it's complicated, right? It's not that clear. It doesn't mean that you have worse outcomes, or at least in our study, it didn't mean that, you fared, at the end, you didn't get any better. There was no symptom alleviation. There was, but the quality of the relationship was compromised along the way.
I really like the point you made there because rapport was the thing that I was really going to emphasize in the sense of you have to really know who you are. So when I think about, even though I primarily work with children, I work with parents, so I work with adults too, right? And so rapport is so important. And if they know themselves and they know that, particularly like if you're coming with an issue particular to race, right? Or if you're coming with an issue that you think is really important for someone to really understand that experience to some extent, I could see where race could be a really important factor in that rapport building process, right? And so I think it's important to, one, ask yourself, what is it that you're looking for and what's really important to you? Because that's going to really influence how you're able to build rapport with another provider. But the reality is, I think the latest statistic, you can tell me, Dr. Akbar, 3% of psychologists are Black, right? And that's a very low percentage. And we're thinking about, we're in a pandemic, we're thinking about all the different problems that exist within the Black community specifically. We can really want to see a provider that looks like us. And I know I've been in situations when I did my postdoc and my undergrad. I did my postdoc and my undergrad at the University of Michigan, which was in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I couldn't find a Black provider. And I had to work really hard to just even find a provider of color so we could maybe have some understanding of this experience, right? Of living in this city and the different things that people who identify as minorities experience. And so I think while the reality is a lot of times people may prefer someone who is same race for the idea or the hope that, we're going to have a lot in common, that's not always a guarantee because we're not monolithic. Everyone has a different experience. We have a range of experiences. But my hope is that our training is strong enough and that in these doctoral programs and in these master's programs, we're being really intentional about cultural competency so that whatever provider you see is able to provide you with what you need. And so that, that rapport is going to be really important. And unfortunately, while we want everyone, you may want to have the same race provider. That's not always an option, just given the number of providers that are available.
Yeah.
And let's not
I want to
forget
thank you guys both for that. You had
I was
something,
just going to
Invisible Man?
actually,
No, I'm
I,
just, you know what time it is. It's out of time. So we have
Well,
to have them
we have
come
a little
back.
more time. We want to have both
Oh,
our guests
really?
give closing statements. We have a little more time. Go ahead,
Okay.
Dr.
Well,
Akbar.
before they do, let me say this. Uh, this is Women's Mental Health Week. And the
Yes.
woman is so important to the family. And so I'm just so happy that it's all women, but I couldn't get a word in edgewise. So that's all I'm going to say. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having us. And Dr. Akbar, I know you were about to respond to what I said, so I want to make space for that.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I also wanted to sort of identify and amplify that linguistic differences are also a huge issue, right? So we're primarily talking about cultural nuances in the therapeutic relationship, but imagine now if you have, if you lack expertise or skill in the native language of the folks that are seeing you, and you have to use an interpreter, and how much disruption that now brings to the therapeutic process. So I just wanted to add that on there because I know that Dr. Butler mentioned that, this is an immigrant community also watches this, and we understand the layers sometimes of hardship that come along in seeking treatment, especially when somebody doesn't speak your language or your dialect and you're trying to get your emotions across. It's so hard to get your emotions across, even if you're like proficient in a language, and now having to do that with like, without having the ease of the same language. So I just want to lift that because I think that also gets lost sometimes in this conversation, and that can be as similarly as complicated.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. But I want you both to just actually get some closing remarks to the audience, and what are some of the things what you want to leave them with, and really how to get folks to come into care, because there's so many of us out here who really need the support. Do we lose Dr. Busby?
Uh-oh.
I'm here. Sorry, I did for a second. I didn't hear the question.
Oh, okay. All right. So I just want to want you guys both get some closing thoughts and what you'd like to tell our audience and have them leave with. And so, Dr. Busby, you want to start?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. One, I just really appreciate you all making time and creating this platform for us to have this such important conversation. And I just wanted to leave people with some resources. So I'm a co-founder of an organization called Black Mental Wellness. And our mission is really threefold. It's all about how do we decrease stigma around mental health treatment and mental health in general within the Black community. We want to increase the diversity of mental health professionals. And then we also want to just educate and provide resources. So on our website, which is www.blackmentalwellness.com, we provide a range of fact sheets around a range of different mental health topics that are from a Black perspective. We really want to make things relatable. We want to make it digestible. We want to make it easy to understand. If anyone's thinking about seeking treatment, we have fact sheets on there that really speak to what are some things you should consider before seeking treatment. What are some questions you should ask a therapist for that first session, if that's something that you're going to decide to do. And so I just wanted to kind of highlight that as something to kind of continue this conversation and continue this work, because I know we were able to talk about a lot of important things, but it was a lot of things we didn't get a chance to talk about. And Invisible Man, we're so sorry we didn't get more from you and hear more of your commentary. However, it's just because it's such a big topic and it's so many layers to it. So I just really appreciate the platform, and I appreciate the time and the intentionality around today's discussion. So thank you.
No, thank you. And that was www.blackmentalhealthprofessionals.com.
No, www.blackmentalwellness.com.
blackmentalwellness.com. So please, audience, hopefully you got it. If you haven't, you can always email me as well. And my email will be up there at the end. So blackmentalwellness.com. Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Dr. Busby. Dr. Akbar?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the first step in this process is educating yourself around some of the conversations that we've had today, understanding more about mental health, and understanding more about, racial trauma. There are tons of different resources now and books that will allow you to self-pace what this education, or what we call psychoeducation, will be like. There are books that talk about racial trauma, racial healing. Like I mentioned, my book, Urban Trauma, that's out there that you can really sort of take your time with it. So take the time to really learn and read and tap into those types of resources. I would say that the other thing that you can do is sort of think about that we are a resilient people, right? We have
Oh,
gone through
yes.
unbelievable amounts of things in our lifetime and in our ancestral lifetimes. And, we still show up. Every day we show up. And there is something really special and really magical about that. And I don't want us to leave here today without lifting and amplifying how special that is, right? And so yes, we may struggle with traumatic experiences. We may struggle with psychological distress. We may struggle with life. Life beats us up sometimes. But remember that you can anchor yourself in that belief system that you can empower yourself to move further. You have that resilient part of you that can move you forward. And on the APA website, there's tons of resources. If you're a parent, there's a project that we call APA Resilience Initiative for parents that are looking of ways to support their children around resiliency, for parents themselves who are tackling things around racism around and want to think about empowerment in a different kind of way. And the last thing that I'll share is that healing begins with talking about your experiences. Don't shortchange yourself that talking to, your faith leader, that talking to your network, that talking to your village is not enough. Because if you don't have access to mental health, if there are barriers to that, you can find people that will be supportive to you. And I would prefer that than nothing. So I leave you with those little tidbits, resources, seeking out the pieces of you that are resilient, and tapping into your network when available so that you are able to begin your process of what healing may look like for you.
Well, I want to thank you both so much. I think this has been really enlightening, especially for me, and I know our audience been enjoying this, because we really need to start focusing on mental health, and especially as we have all gone through trauma, and what we're seeing right now due to everything that's happened over this last year plus, continuum for people of color, especially Black folks and Afro descendants, the trauma that we have experienced, and we haven't really tapped into and talked about it and got over the barriers and the stigma of mental health. Please remember, listen to our two doctors that were on today. There is a stigma, but that stigma, we need to break down those barriers, because if you're out there and you need help, please seek a professional if you need help. And I also want to announce that since this is Black Mental Health Awareness Month and Women's Mental Health Awareness Month, we also in Montgomery County, Maryland, tomorrow they're having the Power to Breathe. And if you want more information about that, it's called the Power to Breathe. I'm not sure if we have the slide of that. If we do have the slide, our producer, if you can put it up, if we have the slide, it was the Power to Breathe. And we're doing a workshop from 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. And it's really to focus on Black mental health, as here in Montgomery County, Maryland, because of things that are happening to us as people of color, the trauma that we've experienced, and we really don't have the power to breathe. And I love the name of it because we really need to take that in. And one other event that is going on tomorrow that I really want people to know about is, as you know, from 1 to 4 in Gaithersburg at, I believe it's Lake Forest Mall. They're going to be having an event because, as you know, a young man, Kwame Osera, from Ghana, was shot and killed by the police here in Montgomery County, the Gaithersburg police. And so tomorrow they're having an event just surrounding his unfortunate death. He was shot and killed by Gaithersburg police. This investigation is still going on. The parents have not really gotten full understanding of what happened to their son. And so tomorrow from 1 to 4, 1 to 4 in Gaithersburg at the Lake Forest Mall, they're having actually people out talking about it. There's going to be food giveaway and showing support of going home for this young man who was killed, shot and killed January 7th in Gaithersburg. So please come out to these events, and that will be a face-to-face, and it also will be Facebook Live. So if you want more information about that for Facebook Live, please take my email so we can send you out the information for Facebook Live. But on that note, I want to thank our host. I want to thank my co-host, the Invisible Man, and I want to and I definitely want to thank my guests, Dr. Busby and Dr. Akbar. You guys have been amazing. I want to thank you so much. And hopefully you will both come on again, because this is something that we really have to start breaking down the pieces. And that's something that we in the Afro-descendant, and I call myself African community, we have to start breaking down the barriers and the stigma to mental health. And I have very good friends who are in the profession, and their practices, unfortunately, are just they're busting at the seams right now because of all the things that happen. And one thing I want to get into that we didn't get to go into was the unfortunate increase of suicide amongst Afro-descendants and those of African descent in this country around just what is going on in the last year. And the continual pressures that our young people are having. So I hope you'll come on again, because we really need to start having this dialogue and having more people come out and getting into therapy, knowing when your friend or someone says, hey, come on, something's happening, at least seek some of intervention, or at least seek someone to talk to. So again, I want to thank Afrique Today for allowing this opportunity to host the Voice of AAU. Thank you again. I am your host, Dr. Yvette Butler-Yaboa, and good night.